Hitman 2-3, this is Hitman 2. What's the status? Over. 2-3, stand by. Goliath, this is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa uniform 259er, 119er. Break. Enemy is unaware of our presence at this time. Over. Solid copy. Hitman 2-3, Echo 5 Foxtrot. This is Hitman 2 actual.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest today is Mr. Greg Mertz. He's the author of this excellent book, Attack in Daylight at Whipton. It's part of the Emerging Civil War series, and it's about the Battle of Shiloh. It's a battlefield guide, and it's an introduction to the battle. I'm not going to offer any apologies for having another Civil War guest on right now. Everybody knows this is usually a World War II airborne channel. Last couple of episodes, we've been talking a lot of Civil War. I'm just on a huge Civil War kick right now, and y'all are going to have to indulge me. So, Greg, thanks for coming on the show today.
My pleasure.
So we were talking beforehand a little bit about your background, and I'm going to apologize right now to everybody for the glare. There's nothing I can do about my lighting. I've been messing with this for about half an hour now. But we were talking anyway about about your background, retired National Park Service Ranger, numerous years at the Fredericksburg National Battlefield, cut your teeth at Gettysburg, got your education from University of Missouri in Shippensburg State, I believe, for your master's degree.
Yes.
So here's a guy with a fantastic education, obviously an orientation on the Eastern Theater in the American Civil War, with so much time at Fredericksburg and getting your initial experiences at Gettysburg. Why Shiloh? Why this focus on the Western Theater? Were you just bored of the Army of the Potomac? How did the book about Shiloh come about?
Well, I'm a native of St. Louis, Missouri, and I belong to a Boy Scout troop which visited Shiloh every spring. There was a scout leader that laid out a series of 6 different trails. So each year we would go and build take whatever trail we hadn't taken in an earlier visit. And the person that laid out the trails set them up as kind of a scavenger hunt. You went to different monuments and plaques and answered questions about them. There was also some reading material for each of the trails. So somewhere along the line, I got hooked. And I can even point it up to a specific moment when on one of my return visits, we're riding through the battlefield, and I asked the adult driver if we were going to be going past that long row of cannon. And one of my leaders, youth leaders, only about a year or two older than me, I guess thought that I've been there long enough that I ought to know what that's called. So he said, it's called Ruggles Battery. And that kind of stung, and I started really delving into reading more about Shiloh and a little bit more about other Civil War battlefields as well. So it got started, my interest in Shiloh got started as an 11-year-old, and something that I've stuck with from throughout my career.
That's terrific. Now, the thing I found really interesting about Shiloh, had the opportunity to go there a couple of times myself. It's a beautifully preserved battlefield. It's I find there's an immediacy there in the close terrain. The monuments are not as prominent as they are at Gettysburg. I think they blend better with the field, and you get a better sense of what it might have felt like to be there. Gettysburg, to me, although I love it, it almost has it's almost too curated. It's like it's truly a memorial. Whereas at Shiloh, I feel like you could step any moment out and find a Union regiment defending their line, or a Confederate organization getting ready to go onto the attack. It's just that close terrain just has a sense about it that I haven't experienced at any other battlefield. Do you think the relative remoteness of where that site is compared to a lot of the different battlefields, especially in the Eastern Theater, might account for the fact it's not as well known? I mean, I know students of the Civil War understand it, but whenever you get on Facebook, you talk about, hey, where have you visited for American history? Everyone always talks about Gettysburg. A lot of folks talk about Manassas. You don't really hear about people making the trek out to Shiloh. And I'm wondering what do you think might account for that?
You really have to make an effort to go to visit Shiloh. It's not along the way to anywhere, whereas opposed to my career at Gettysburg or Fredericksburg, it's a part of a visit that includes going to Washington, D.C. to the north of Fredericksburg, or Williamsburg to the south of it, where much of my career has been along kind of a range where you can go from one thing to another that it would be of great interest. So yeah, I think part of the reason it has relatively light visitation is because of the rural character. It is located. I'm trying to think just how far to the west of Memphis, but it's at least an hour's drive west of Memphis. Um, and
It's just
so
tucked
yeah,
down in the southwest corner of Tennessee.
yeah.
So, and additionally, again, and that question kind of ties into my larger question of a lot of folks, really enjoy reading about the Eastern Theater. The Grant Lee battles get a lot of attention. Who's the better general? But when you take a look at what's happening in the Western Theater in 1862, the success at Forts Henry and Donelson, and now the advance up the Tennessee River, and then you have this big clash at Pittsburgh Landing that turns into the Battle of Shiloh. Most casualties in one battle ever up to that point in American history. You got a lot of folks who are going to be future players especially on the Union side with Grant and Sherman on the ground there. You've got arguably the Confederacy's greatest general in Albert City, Johnston, is there, who meets his untimely demise. There's a lot of drama associated with that battle. But again, there's not a lot in the popular histories right now. Off the top of my head, if I turn around and grabbed, I've got several hundred Civil War volumes. I think I've got 2 on Shiloh, and I've probably got 25 on Gettysburg. Yeah, I'm wondering if there is to your knowledge, you're a man of your experience and background, why there's not as much written about Shiloh when it is such a dramatic turn of events. There's so many players who had made later reputations in the war. It had huge repercussions on how the Western Theater developed. Um, you could arguably saved Kentucky from any further serious invasions. There's so many different things you can say about the impact and import of that battle, and it's addressed in larger books like Shelby Foote's 3 volumes and things like that, but it has very few standalone volumes that seem to have any have captured the public imagination the way Eastern battles have. Do you think I'm onto something there, or am I missing the boat?
Well, I know there are a lot of folks that have more volumes on Gettysburg in their Civil War library than they do the rest of the war all combined. So there are certain battles that just attract multiple volumes and studies of micro aspects of the battle. Like as I compare it to the battlefields where I worked just before I retired, Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, Wilderness and Spotsylvania, I would say Shiloh has about the same number of volumes as those particular battles. The one that I would have gotten started on was Wiley Sword's Bloody April, that came out probably in the mid 1970s or so. That's really the first serious volume on the Battle of Shiloh. And the most recent would be Conquer or Perish by Tim Smith. That'll be the definitive work for quite some time. And so those are kind of the first of the serious volumes related to Shiloh, and the latest. And there are some others that are kind of in between. I also like the book that Larry Daniels did, because I myself am very geographical. It may sound strange, but if I'm reading a Civil War book, I will even kind of photocopy the maps to have them by my side, so I don't have to flip back saying, okay, where is this landmark? So his book is broken down geographically, more or less. There's a heading for each section. I know I'm going to be reading about this area of the battlefield until I run into the next section. So not only are there several volumes out there, but again, you got your classic and your what I call definitive source, and then all others written in different manners that might again be geographic, or even kind of focus a little more on Union or focus a little more on Confederate.
Yes, sir. And I'm right there with you. You can't read a book about a military campaign without a great appreciation for the geography. I always have an atlas or a map with me, separate from what's available in the book if I'm reading a Civil War book in particular. Uh, Larry Daniels is that's a fantastic volume. I'm right there with you. So your motivation for writing this book, because it's written as a tour guide, someone with no understanding of the battle can use this book to navigate the battlefield and get a really good idea of what's going on there. I'm aware of the Army War College series on different battlefields that provides the same kind of driving tour, but yours is written in such a way that I find it more accessible. Nothing against the Army War College guides, I love them. I have several in my collection, but they rely very heavily on the official record, which is a great place to start. But you seemed to be able to find some additional immediate type tales about each stop and really kind of humanize the battle in a way I don't get when I read the official records. So what was your motivation for writing the book, and how did you go about finding the material that you used to describe each stop along the tour?
Well, this book, as you mentioned, is part of the Emerging Civil War series, and one of the goals of the Emerging Civil War series is to try to get young new authors involved in the writing. So Chris Mikowski, I should say everybody that has ever trained under me, and part of my job with the National Park Service is to train volunteers and new employees. So Chris Mikowski, being both a former volunteer and former employee at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, knew that I got hooked on the Civil War with Shiloh. So he asked me if I'd be interested in writing that book. And I don't fit the typical author criteria that he seemed to have, because I'm obviously not young, but as kind of a thank you for getting so many young people started in the history business, he said that they would, if I wanted the opportunity to write about that, since they knew I had such great interest, that they wanted to ask me. So that's kind of how I got into it. So I gladly accepted that. And as far as the philosophy, one of the things that also made it very attractive is the tour guide element of it. So hopefully in the book you find a little bit of experience of someone that's been a frontline personal services interpreter with the National Park Service, taking a look at how to adapt what I normally do on the field to a written form. So I appreciate the compliment that as you go to the stops, you felt that they kind of delved more into some human elements and making some stronger connections with the land and the story.
Yes, sir. Now, for the folks who are listening, I hate to insult anyone's intelligence, but can you give us the 1 minute synopsis of the battle for people who might not be students of the Civil War, or might not understand what happened at Shiloh in particular, and then we can kind of explore the elements a little bit more?
Sure, it's fought in April of 1862. So the Civil War is not quite 1 year old when the battle is fought. It is a battle that, as you mentioned earlier, comes after the Confederates suffered some defeats in February of 1862 at places called Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. When those fell, a Confederate line that was basically along the Tennessee-Kentucky line had to fall back and regroup in northern Mississippi, and Union forces came south up the Tennessee River, camped about 20 miles from where the Confederates were gathering at Corinth, Mississippi, with the idea that another Union army coming from the Nashville area, the army that will camp around Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River and around Shiloh Church, is under Ulysses S. Grant, but another army under Don Carlos Buell is marching toward him. And when those two armies unite, it is thought that they will then move down to Corinth and defeat the Confederates. Well, the Confederates gathered at Corinth, Mississippi, realized that these two armies are about to come together and decide to strike before that merger takes place. So on April 6th, the first day of this two-day battle, the Confederates attack the Union Army. The Union Army will be attacked in their camps. They will fall back, and by the time the battle is over, of the 5 divisions that were camped there, 4 of the division camps are in Confederate hands. But the Union Army holds on to their landing on the Tennessee-Pittsburgh landing, and that evening, the reinforcements of General Buell and some other reinforcements of Grant's army are able to join with Grant, and the second day will be Grant attacking, driving the Confederates back out for overall a Union victory, a hard-fought Union victory, kind of an ugly victory in that they were surprised on the first day by the Confederate attacks.
Yes, sir. So, a couple points that I want to dig in a little deeper and ask some questions, and we'll start with that being surprised on the first day. You get this sense you've got General Sherman. He's division commander at that time under Grant. He's kind of occupying the forwardmost positions of the line, and no attempts really to establish breastworks. They put out pickets and things like that, but there's no fortifications, no digging in. The idea being, hey, time is better spent drilling our relatively new and raw troops, or very new and raw troops in some cases, rather than digging in. And that it runs counter to lessons learned throughout the war, where, hey, if you stop for a minute, you start digging in order to be able to better defend yourselves. What's your take on, was that tactical laziness, or was that a deliberate decision? Oh, we need to be drilling our troops rather than digging like moles. Being a former soldier, I can't imagine being anywhere in the vicinity of the enemy and not taking proper steps to improve one's position. So based off your research and your own interpretation, what do you make of the "we didn't think breastworks were a good use of our time" argument that came from Sherman and Grant after the accusations of, hey, you guys were surprised, started coming out?
Yeah, as with a lot of aspects of history, there's not a simple answer to it, and there are a lot of factors that played into it. One of the first ones is Sherman's own mindset. Now Sherman very early in the war had been a department commander. Actually had once commanded the army that Buell commanded at the Battle of Shiloh, and in his department, he was asked, how many troops he would need to take the offensive against the Confederates, and he gave an answer of 200,000 soldiers, and everybody thought, that's completely unrealistic. Sherman seemed to see Confederate threats in a lot of different places, and some would say that he had a nervous breakdown. So he would get relieved of that command, would get an assignment in St. Louis, and through the help of his brother, who was a United States Senator, and the department commander who has had his headquarters in St. Louis, his name was Henry Halleck, apparently seeing some talent in Sherman, he would get a position back in the field again. And a lot of people think that Sherman, because he had earlier in his career overreacted to Confederates near his command, is going to kind of purposely realize that's a fault of his and make sure he doesn't overreact to reports of enemy forces nearby him, which he will receive. And so he doesn't completely ignore them. He will be involved in some reconnaissances that do not conclude decisively, at least in his mind, that the Confederate Army is nearby. Another aspect in regard to earthworks, the chief engineer of the Army, who would eventually become a Corps and Army group, Army commander in the Army group of the Atlanta campaign, James McPherson, is sent out to see lay out a line for earthworks. And one of the things that he reported back is, well, the place where we should erect earthworks is where Union troops are already camped. So for some reason, a decision was made not to have Union troops reposition their camps just so we can build earthworks at the ideal spot overlooking streams. So those are a couple aspects. One is, I think, Sherman trying to compensate for an overreaction earlier in his career, and the fact that it would, to put earthworks at the proper places would call for a lot of the troops to have to reposition their camps.
Gotcha. That's actually two points that I had not fully considered before. I was out very much focused on that idea of we're drilling our troops to get them ready for the maintain the offensive. So those are both really interesting, especially the psychological aspects as relate to Sherman, who, by the way, had a great battle. Once they got attacked, he's, I'm a Sherman fan unabashedly, and he did a masterful job of ensuring that they contested every inch of ground as they kind of compressed up against the Tennessee River. So I'm not taking anything away from him as a combat commander. Another point I wanted to ask you about, and this is something that I've lately come to understand, at least I think a little bit more. I'm impressed by the idea that Shiloh, it's almost an Antietam in reverse, with the Union on the defensive, the Confederacy attacking. But as the Confederacy was attacking, there was no overall, in my opinion, command and control. Now at Antietam, McClellan was distant from the battlefield, committing forces piecemeal. I found that Albert Sidney Johnston is the overall commander of Confederate forces at Shiloh. General officer leading from the front. There's a lot to admire, but he placed himself so far forward, he was not able really to exercise any control over his subordinate commanders, thereby allowing the Union an opportunity to react to crises as they occur, rather than overwhelming them with a series of crises before they could react to the one at hand. I think my interpretation was that allows the Union to hang on till nightfall and then get reinforced by Buell and go on the offensive the next day. What's your opinion of Johnston's generalship? Did he place himself too far forward? I mean, the guy got killed, so that's definitely an indicator that he might have been a little too close to the front line. But do you think he could have done, given the nature of the terrain, available communications, etc., do you think he could have exercised better overall command and control and maybe scored a victory on the first day if he was more centrally located and available to subordinate commanders? Or do you think that because of the way the 19th century was, there was no radio communications? Once you fired your projectile of an army, you just had to get what you got, and he just put himself where he felt he could do the most good? What's your interpretation of his generalship, sir?
Perhaps the most important factor to throw in there are problems with the way in which the Confederate forces were aligned, and as we talk about command and control, the inability of the corps commanders to have any reasonable amount of command and control. Johnston would send a telegram to Jefferson Davis a few days before the battle, explaining that the battle plan was going to call for 3 of his 4 corps to line up side by side, and then 1 back in reserve. So any corps commander on the front, by the way Johnston wanted the troops to be aligned, would have a smaller area of the front. The reserves immediately behind them would be from their own command. And also, more importantly, the corps that was to be to the right was commanded by the man that Johnston had the most confidence in, and that was Braxton Bragg. Now, I know for Civil War enthusiasts that hear that, they're going to shudder because of his later reputation. But at the moment, Bragg had done some things that Johnston found very impressive. The largest corps of the army was Bragg's, and it was placed on the right. The plan of battle was for the Confederate right to kind of pivot to try to drive the Union forces to the north and northwest of where they were camped and drive them into Owl Creek, which was a swollen stream. So the key to the Confederate plan to drive Union forces into Owl Creek rather than, say, drive them back toward Pittsburgh Landing, is how the battle basically was fought, relied upon somebody on the right to make sure that that aspect of the battle was working out well. And so when the battle started, well, to back up, so that is the plan. Johnston entrusted that to alignment to his second in command, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. And Beauregard did not align the troops the way Johnston had directed. He put one corps in front, one corps in the second line, and then stacked up two corps and reserves in the back. So there's nobody in charge on the right. A corps commander has in charge of the command of the entire front. And what would soon happen as the battle got underway, all three of those corps merged into each other, and the corps commanders in and of themselves decided, all right, we're going to take over different sectors of the battlefield and give orders to whatever troops happen to be in that sector, whether they're in our corps or somebody else's. So command and control had broken down at many levels. Since Johnston did not live, we did not have an opportunity to ask him why he did what he did, but he would eventually place himself on the Confederate right and would spend much of his time trying to make sure that the Confederate right got on the Union left flank and would start to push those troops up to the north and to try to get Confederates to get as close to the Tennessee River to cut them off from their supply line at Pittsburgh Landing as possible. So in many respects, but with that being the biggest reason, I think that Johnston placed himself at the right spot, that he needed somebody to be able to make sure that the Confederate right functioned in conjunction with his plan, and again, knowing that the troops were all going to get jumbled together because of the way Beauregard organized the men.
Yes, sir. So there's a lot of cliches about, the fog of war, or, no plan survives contact with the enemy. But in this instance, it's like no plan survives contact with Beauregard, it sounds like. Now, Beauregard at that point had a great reputation. He had done well at First Manassas. He was the hero of Fort Sumter, all that kind of stuff. He had a reputation as a theorist as well as a guy who could do stuff in the field. Do you think he was believing his own press, and that's why he kind of altered the plan that Johnston had given him? Or were there constraints of terrain, constraints of, avenues of approach? Was he like, this isn't going to work the way it looks on paper because the ground is not laid out in order to achieve what General Johnston wants, so I'm going to do the best I can with the reality of the terrain? Why do you think he altered the troop dispositions?
It could be that because the troops, each corps would arrive up to the front at a different time, that he felt to not have a complete battlefront at any moment. And again, knowing that the Union Army might discover them and might react, so I can see that maybe he felt the moment you get that close to the enemy, that I've got to just get that first corps to arrive, to put up a broad front, not a narrow one where their flanks might be hit while I wait for other corps to slide in place. That's Beauregard would never explain exactly why he did that, but as I'm trying to look and say what's the logic to it, that's the most logical thing that I can think of. I think that perhaps also his ego played a role in it, and that he kind of thought he knew what was best. It's kind of very difficult to figure out the exact relationship between Beauregard and Johnston, because when Beauregard would write about the battle, and the time leading up to the battle. It almost sounds like, and it's not much of an exaggeration to say that everything that the Confederates did right was something that was Beauregard's idea in his own writing, or things that he had to encourage Johnston to do. Even in looking at some of the criticism that Beauregard will launch against Johnston, for example, on the night before the battle, Johnston stumbles upon a council of war in Beauregard's camp. And Beauregard and Bragg both tell Johnston that they think that the Union Army must be aware of the presence of the Confederates and must be, entrenched up to their eyes. And Johnston just announced, we're going to attack the next day. We're going to attack at daylight, and we'll tell his staff we'll water our horses in the Tennessee River and things along that line. And Beauregard goes, and Johnston did not seek to hear what other people had to say at that meeting. He just announced, after hearing their initial objection, that he was going to attack. Yet, if you look at some other things down in Corinth, when Beauregard apparently gets the intelligence that says that Buell is closing in on Grant, that now's the time to attack, he said, rather than Johnston give an immediate answer, he decided to go and consult with Bragg. So if he consults with somebody, Beauregard gives you the idea that Johnston vacillates. If he makes a decision immediately and doesn't consult with others, he complains about that too. So reading Beauregard's accounts is very interesting. It almost appears that Johnston can't do anything right.
Understood. Now looking at things from the Union side, the big question I have for you regarding the attacks on the first day and the Union defense on the first day is tied to Prentiss and his 6th Division. Any even casual student of the war knows about the Hornets' Nest, and as the Union Army is falling back, giving ground grudgingly, but giving ground, Prentiss makes this big stand, and ostensibly he's getting a lot of Confederate attention, and he's holding up the attack. And early accounts would kind of credit him with allowing, trading time for space kind of thing, until the Hornets' Nest is eventually pummeled by that big line of cannon that you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. I've seen some more recent scholarship that maybe what was happening at the Hornets' Nest was not as impactful as Prentiss believed at the time, that it was, rather than attracting a lot of attention, although the men who were defending the Hornets' Nest were certainly under fire, they were bypassed by a lot of Confederate formations, and they didn't have as big of an impact tactically as Prentiss believed they did in delaying the assault. I was wondering what your interpretation of that was.
It's interesting being a student of the Battle of Shiloh starting at the age of 11 years old, when that was very much part of the narrative, whether you go by the interpretation out on the battlefield or the movie, but that Prentiss and his men hold up at the Hornets' Nest to buy Grant time to establish his last line, and that he's kind of one of the heroes of the battle. As delve more into it, number one, Grant, even with his writings at the time, I don't know his words exactly, but he basically says that, when Prentiss was unable to pull out in time to join the last line, and it's hard to be real critical of someone who made such a hard stand and got himself captured and so forth. But Grant really kind of implies that he made a mistake. He didn't pull out in time, that there was no reason for him to sacrifice. Although Prentiss will write that his goal was to hold on, or that he apparently had orders to hold on until nighttime. There were even the conversations he had with other people that he intended to, on the first day of the battle, have the opportunity to recapture his camps and plan on spending that night, the first night of the battle, back in his headquarters, back in his camps. Very unrealistic. Another factor to look at is that the first park historian at Shiloh was D.W. Reed, who happened to be not in Prentice's command, but in W.H.L. Wallace's command, another division that fought right in the Hornets' nest. And part of the natural tendency of someone is to, I think, place importance on what they did. So not only do you have Prentice claiming that he saved the Union Army at Shiloh, but you have D.W. Reed placing a lot of importance on the stand at the Hornets' nest. And then one other factor to kind of look at is that early on, there was a reconnaissance. The battle really got started with some of Prentice's troops sent out by a senior colonel brigade commander named Everett Peabody, that went out and made contact with the Confederate forces, fought in skirmish formation until the Confederates advanced in their battle line and they could actually see what the Confederates were doing and could announce that there is an attack coming our way. Not just that there are large numbers of Confederates out there, but they're moving toward us, get ready. And when the reconnoitering party rode back into Prentice's camp, Prentice rode up to Peabody and said, our assignments, our orders are not to engage the enemy until Buell arrives here. You've gotten us involved in a battle that we are not prepared for, and I'm going to hold you responsible, to which Peabody, by one account, says, I'm responsible for all my acts. Peabody will get killed in the early fighting. And so interestingly, you'd think that somewhere along the line, superiors would tout the great job that Peabody had done in taking his own initiative to discover the enemy out there and give warning of the upcoming attack. But no, that really doesn't happen until many years later. So part of what I think is behind Prentice touting his success on the Hornets' Nest line is also to downplay the job that Peabody had done in giving some warning for Prentice and Sherman's men to make as good a stand as they did on the camps in dealing with the initial Confederate attacks.
Yes, sir. And that leads me to, I've got four more big questions that I want to address. And the first one being, as the narrative initially gets established, as you said, people have a stake in their version, whether it's their reputation, the reputation of their units. Is there, when you're doing interpretation as a park ranger and you're on the ground, obviously you probably spend a lot of time in the primary resources, familiarizing yourself with different interpretations. Are there efforts by the Park Service to use things like battlefield archaeology or other techniques to be able to see if there are artifacts or material record that can show what actually happened on the ground, like in order to be able to ascertain, hey, maybe there's not enough ordnance on the ground here to indicate that the fight was as big as a commander might have said, or something like that, using metal detection or other types of interpretation? Are there any efforts like that to be able to tie the material record to the written record in order to be able to get a better interpretation of what occurred?
With few exceptions, the National Park Service uses archaeology for two different reasons. One is if there's a construction project that's being proposed somewhere, the organization likes to make sure that they don't damage some archaeological resource that they are unaware of. So we'll do that in those circumstances. The other thing that I'm mainly familiar with is if there is a landmark, like a house site, that would help us better understand our maps and so forth that we are looking to find. The big exception to that fits most into the category of what you're asking about is the Little Bighorn battlefield, where there happened to be a fire that swept through the area. So just kind of took down all the underbrush there and gave them an opportunity to really go over the battlefield and recover artifacts and get a better idea of exactly where some of the positions were. So it does happen, but not as often as you might think.
Yes, sir. That's great to know. So we kind of talked through the first day, and the daylight running out kind of has everybody sort of stop where they are and sleep on their arms. And as you indicated, the Army of the Ohio under Don Carlos Buell is approaching. They arrive, I believe they arrived that evening and start crossing. Is that correct, sir? Or do they not really make their crossing until the next morning of the Tennessee River?
There are actually a couple of regiments that cross over on the first day and do even get engaged and suffer very light casualties. So yes, some of Buell starts to arrive, but just a little.
So Buell, his interpretation is going to be, I saved the day. Grant's on the ropes. Here comes the Army of the Ohio, and we're going to reinforce and turn the tide here, and we're going to push the Confederates back. Whereas, Grant pretty much thought he had things under control. It's great to have Buell here, but, we got this anyway. What, in your opinion, affected Buell's ability to kind of have his narrative gain any kind of prominence? Because everyone knows who Grant is. Not very few people know who Don Carlos Buell is, and the Army of the Ohio doesn't, in my opinion, unless you're reading a scholarly account, get a lot of credit for what it did at Shiloh.
Well, one of the things that helped the Buell narrative are many of the common soldiers in the Army of the Tennessee. Many of them will write about the battle saying, oh, we got shoved out of our camps on the first day, but Buell arrived on the second day and saved our army, and with his help we made this counterattack. So even though Grant would hold firm toward, oh, I didn't need any help other than my own division that wasn't on the field the first day arriving, which was under a man named Lew Wallace, feeling that that Grant could have handled everything with just his one division coming in, but that many of his own men saw great value in the fact that Buell's army arrived. They will also write that Buell saved the day for them.
Yes, sir. And you segue right into my next point, talking about Lew Wallace and the Lost Division, as it were. So could you kind of run down briefly, for folks who might not be aware, why that division was sort of not on the field on the first day?
And that in story is important enough that the only appendix that I have in my book is a member of my staff who happens to be very interested in Lew Wallace and in Monocacy, wrote for me to cover that march. But the old narrative, and I can even remember, again, watching the old Shiloh film when I was a boy, that you're in the visitor center and here's Wallace holding his map, walking up to some farmer, kind of pointing, trying to figure out which roads to take. And the original narrative is that Lew Wallace, who was camped to the north of the battlefield, got orders to march there and got lost along the way and didn't make it there on the first day. That what should have been perhaps a 3-hour march for his troops ended up consuming all day. That he didn't arrive on the battlefield until dark. Well, the truth of the matter is that Lew Wallace was never lost, and that when he got his orders, and the orders were never written, it'd be important if we knew exactly what his orders were, but he claims that, as Lew Wallace claimed, his orders were to take position on the right of the Union Army. And because his troops had been separated from the main army by Owl Creek, and that's the creek that the Confederates wanted to drive the Union Army into, trap and pin them up against Owl Creek, that road had been, or that stream had been flooded. And so kind of naturally, the area of the stream closest to the Tennessee River is going to back up the most. So the most direct road from Lew Wallace down to Pittsburgh Landing is a road that Wallace believed was underwater. And further inland, further away from inland, but further away from the river, the stream is not nearly as badly flooded, and Wallace had been involved with repairing a road crossing Owl Creek further miles west of the Tennessee River. So was aware that there was a road that was open that would lead him to where Sherman's camp was. So Wallace is marching along the way, and eventually some of Grant's aides catch up with him to say, what are you doing way out here? And he says, well, I'm taking the road that will lead to the right of Sherman, the right of the army. And they say, great God, don't you know that Sherman's been driven out of his camps, and we're trying to hang on right now that we might be driven into the Tennessee River? And with that, then Wallace is informed that the waters have receded enough that the road that led directly from his camp to Pittsburgh Landing is open. And so he turns around and marches back, arriving later. Now, he makes some mistakes. A lot of people are critical, like for when he gets the orders to turn his troops around. He could have simply done an about face, but he decided, I want my most experienced troops to arrive first. So he takes the head of his column and backtracks. So you've got this one stretch of road where you've got people waiting in there while others are backtracking. And so that's going to go very slowly for a variety of reasons. So not to say Wallace is without any blame, but the main thing that you hear about Wallace is that he was lost, and that simply is not true.
Understood. Now, what ifs are never very useful, but they're a lot of fun. Do you think if Wallace had proceeded along that route and wound up where the right of the Union Army had been at the beginning of the battle, would he have been far enough west to come in on the flank of the Confederates and almost do a Jackson at Chancellorsville and start rolling them up? Or would the terrain just not be conducive to that?
Interestingly, as Wallace received a lot of criticism for his role at Shiloh, one of his narratives was that was his plan until he went to visit the battlefield again after the war and looked at it and realized, that wouldn't have been feasible. That wouldn't have worked. So then he kind of stopped that particular narrative. So Wallace himself thought of giving that as a reason, but concluded no.
Gotcha, sir. And my last question for you, and it's a combination of an observation and a question. Despite a lot of mistakes that Grant made at that battle, not insisting on entrenching, for example, and then the insistence that, I had this under control, I didn't need Buell and the Army of the Ohio, I think that this, more than Henry and Donaldson, this is where we see the war really start to reveal his character, in that he was, a lot of folks would have said, hey, we're on the ropes at the end of the first day, and start thinking how they might be able to organize a retreat across the Tennessee, or let's get a natural barrier between us and the Confederates. And he's just thinking about, hey, we're going to go back on the offensive. We're going to lick them tomorrow, though, as he supposedly said to Sherman that night. Do you feel that he had that confidence was truly revealed there, or do you think he did not have as much of an appreciation at the time for what he was facing, and it was more a happy accident that he was able to stay in place and attack the next day? What do you think his state of mind really was, based off of your research and reading?
There's a lot of evidence, I think, that he gave a serious amount of thought to the condition of his army. There is an example of when the Confederates do attack Grant's last line, of somebody seeing him talking to himself, and got a little closer and heard him say, not beaten by a damn sight. And then of the conversations that you alluded to, there are several, including one involving Buell, and some of the witnesses said that it was really in doubt whether Buell would send his troops across the river to reinforce the army, that the situation might have looked bad enough that he felt that would have been a waste of his troops to bring them across. And having a conversation with Grant in which he says, I have not given up the idea of defeating them yet. The conversation with Sherman is particularly interesting because Sherman walked up to him feeling that he was going, at the end of the day, feeling he would have to ask if about making a retreat, and decided to open his conversation differently on just the spur of the moment. Just kind of said, well, they've had the devil's own day today, haven't they? And Grant says, yeah, we'll lick them tomorrow, though. So his determination is really a key, and it's something that I think he was cognizant of throughout the day. Now, during most of the day, he's saying, hey, you guys that are fighting on the field, just hold on as long as you can because reinforcements are on the way. He was sure, for example, that Lew Wallace would be arriving on that first day. So part of his confidence early on is the expectation of reinforcements coming. But then toward the end of the day, I think as the fighting got along Grant's last line, as a kind of, I shared that comment about somebody hearing him talking to himself, not beaten by a damn sight. He's now trying to size that up. And it's not just a blind determination, oh, I'm going to stay here no matter what. But I think he realized by the end of the day that he could hold on, and maybe realize something that we would later find out, that Civil War armies were very, very resilient.
Yes,
Whether you look at the Union Army at the first day at Gettysburg or being driven in during Jackson's flank attack at Chancellorsville, there are just many examples where the Union Army is rather resilient. But that's a little of my take of looking at Grant at the battle, and that is something very important that he decided on that field, and I think would learn and take to other battlefields as well.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And that line, when you talk about his last line, that was really a massive battery of its own right. That was more of an artillery position. Obviously, there's infantry there as well, but if I recall my reading correctly, he massed a significant amount of artillery along that line to make it very difficult for the enemy to take that position. And for folks who haven't been to Pittsburgh Landing or in the Shiloh battlefield, that is a naturally strong position. So it's an uphill approach for any infantry attacking from the south. A lot of small water courses disrupting the terrain, and if you're covering that with a lot of artillery, that's a strong place to be if you're on the defense. So I can see how that would also play into his confidence.
Absolutely. The Colonel Webster, who was his chief of staff, Dartmouth graduate and engineer with a good feel for the lay of the land, positioned those cannon there starting in mid-afternoon, kind of knowing they might need a place to rally the troops along. And again, as we were talking about before, that some of Grant's writing suggests that Prentiss just waited too long to fall back, that it wasn't necessary for him to make that sacrifice. But many of the troops from the Hornets' nest position would have an opportunity to fall back to that last line. Again, a nice, logical place to rally the troops among that line of guns. Worked out very well for the Union Army.
Yes, sir. And just to kind of wrap up the narrative for everyone who's listening, they did lick them tomorrow, as one would indicate from Grant's words, or would infer from Grant's words, excuse me. The battle did go into the 7th of April, and the Union did go on the offensive, and the Confederate troops did wind up being defeated and fall back on Corinth, which opens up a whole nother campaign in the West. So it's a fascinating narrative. Is there anything we haven't addressed that you find particularly interesting about the battle that you'd like to share with us, Greg?
Well, one other thing, again, as someone that's been taking a look at this battle for many years, we've touched on a little bit of it, but the many things that were kind of part of the common narrative back in the 1960s and 70s that we have since kind of learned are different. We talked some about Prentice's reputation. We talked about whether Lew Wallace was lost or not. There are just so many aspects of this battle, ranging from, I mean, one of the things that I kind of got hooked on as a boy was learning the story of Johnny Shiloh, Johnny Clem, who was a real live person who is said to be the drummer boy of Shiloh, but research has since kind of strongly suggested, or at least they've proven, that the unit he belonged to was not in existence yet. That's not to say that he wasn't somehow there, but that a lot of the things that we first learned about Shiloh just are not true. Another big story, the sunken road, a eroded road bed that runs kind of through the Hornet's nest or adjacent to the Hornet's nest. When I first visited there, there's this deep eroded road bed, and you walk through there and you can kind of say, oh, I can easily see why Union soldiers want to stand in here where the bottom of their body is kind of protected, only to find that you can't find an account during the battle that talks about the road being eroded. They talk about just a couple of ruts that's maybe, your traditional 6-inch ruts that over the years it got worn down, and the park since restored it by filling that in. But I remember going there once after having not been there for many years. I kind of got on a photography kick and was like, oh, I'm going to go get a good picture of the sunken road. And I walked the whole stretch and never took a picture. And I'm like, what happened to it? So there are many, many aspects of the Battle of Shiloh that we now learn are different than what we first thought, or at least what I first thought. So that's another what I find fascinating aspect of this. If I got hooked on any other Civil War battlefield at the age of 11, I don't know if I would have seen the interpretation and understanding of the battle change as much as the Shiloh battlefield.
Yes, sir. Well, you're certainly the guy to write this book, sir, having that early experience with your Boy Scout troop. And it sounds like a great opportunity to actually walk the terrain and really get the battle imprinted on your soul in order to be able to write a book like this. It's been a few years since I've had the opportunity to be at Shiloh. Like I said, it's one of my favorite battlefields to go to. Now that I have this wonderful copy of your book, I can't wait to get back there and do the battlefield through your eyes. So once again, everybody, my guest today has been Greg Mertz. He's the author of the book Attack at Daylight and Whip Them, which is available through the Emerging Civil War series, a fantastic series of books on the American Civil War, different battlefields, different interpretations of campaigns, and a great place to get started to learn about an aspect of the war you might be interested in, and to then get some direction on where to go from there. So Greg, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, sir, you have a great day.
You too.